It was just a photograph of a mother and her son from 1885, but their hands revealed a dark secret. The image arrived at the Historical Preservation Society in Richmond, Virginia, on a humid Tuesday morning in March. Sarah Mitchell, a curator specializing in post-Civil War photography, carefully removed the cardboard frame from its manila envelope. The portrait showed a black woman, perhaps in her 40s, seated in an ornate studio chair, with her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a young boy beside her. They were dressed in their finest clothes, she in a dark dress with a white collar, he in a pressed suit that hung slightly too large for his thin frame. Sarah had examined hundreds of similar studio portraits from the 1880s, keepsakes newly accessible to formerly enslaved families who treasured these images as proof of freedom hard won. But something about this photograph held her attention longer than usual. The woman's eyes carried a weight that seemed to reach across nearly 140 years, and the boy, no older than 10, stood with a stiff formality, as if instructed not to move a muscle. A note tucked into the envelope read, "My great-great-grandmother Clara and her son Thomas, taken 1885, Richmond, the only photograph we have of her." The sender, Patricia Coleman, asked the Society to help preserve and document the image. Under a desk lamp, Sarah studied the studio backdrop, a painted garden scene common to the period. The details were sharp. The fabric textures, the slight blur of the boy's hand where he had moved during the long exposure, the carefully arranged folds of Clara's skirt. It was professional work, likely from one of Richmond's better studios, serving black clients after the war. Sarah lifted a magnifying glass, scanning for signatures of the photographer's style, the props, the posing, the lighting. Then she froze. Clara's left hand, folded neatly in her lap, revealed something unsettling. Even through the sepia tones, the skin around her wrists appeared textured, scarred. Sarah leaned in, adjusting magnification. There, two distinct, raised bands encircled each wrist, shackling scars, permanent, unmistakable. Her heart began to race. She had seen these marks before in archived images of formerly enslaved people. These were not accidental injuries. They were the result of prolonged restraint, years of it, evidence of bondage carried permanently on the body. Sarah photographed the image using high-resolution equipment to avoid damaging the original. The scarring became even clearer in digital form. Thick bands roughly 2 inches wide, the tissue discolored and uneven. Clara had tried to hide them, folding her hands just so, but the studio lighting had caught what she may have wished to keep unseen. Sarah turned to Civil War and Reconstruction-era records. The date, 1885, was 20 years after emancipation, 17 after the 14th Amendment. Many formerly enslaved people were building new lives, raising families, working paid jobs, voting, carving out space in a country that once claimed ownership of them. Yet bondage left traces the world could not erase. Clara's wrists told a story deeper than any posed portrait could convey. She called Patricia Coleman that afternoon. When Sarah explained what she had discovered, the scarring, the likely evidence of shackles, Patricia fell silent. When she finally spoke, her voice shook. All these years, none of us knew what we were looking at. Sarah spent a week buried in archives, slave narratives, estate ledgers, manumission papers. She traced records across South Carolina, Clara's likely birthplace, but the name appeared too often, too vaguely. Then a breakthrough arrived from Dr. Marcus Webb at the College of Charleston. He recognized the backdrop as the work of Jonathan Blake, a Richmond photographer known for treating black clients with dignity and recording them with the same care as wealthy white families. If it was indeed Blake's work, studio records might exist. 2 days later, Sarah sat in the Virginia Historical Society reading room, turning the pages of 3 leather-bound ledgers, and there it was, May 15th, 1885. Clara, portrait with son Thomas. Lady spoke little, dignified. Boy approx. 10 years. Payment $2.50, paid in full. Sarah stared, breath unsteady. $2.50, a considerable sum for a seamstress. This portrait had been chosen, planned, paid for. Clara wanted proof that she and Thomas existed as free people, a legacy captured in one fragile rectangle of paper. Yet Blake noted nothing of her scars. The answers Sarah sought lay deeper, waiting in records, family memories, and histories forgotten or hidden for generations. It was simply a photograph, a mother and her son, captured in 1885. But their hands revealed a dark history. The picture arrived at the Historical Preservation Society in Richmond, Virginia, on a humid Tuesday morning in March. Sarah Mitchell, a curator specializing in post-Civil War American photography, gently removed the cardboard frame from its worn manila envelope. The portrait showed a black woman, perhaps in her 40s, seated in an ornate studio chair, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy standing beside her. Both were dressed in their finest clothing. She in a dark dress with a crisp white collar, he in a suit slightly too large for his thin frame. Sarah had studied hundreds of portraits like this one. As studio photography grew more accessible during Reconstruction, families who had once been enslaved embraced these images as evidence of freedom, dignity, and permanence. Yet something about this photograph held her attention longer than most. The woman's eyes seemed weighted with experience, reaching across nearly 140 years. The boy, no older than 10, stood stiffly, trained to remain absolutely still for the long exposure. A handwritten note tucked into the envelope identified them. My great-great-grandmother Clara and her son Thomas, taken 1885, Richmond, the only photograph we have of her. The sender, Patricia Coleman, asked the Society to preserve and document it. Under her desk lamp, Sarah studied every detail: the painted garden backdrop, typical of Victorian studios, the texture of fabric, the slight blur of the boy's moving hand. The craftsmanship suggested a skilled photographer, likely among Richmond's early professionals, willing to serve black clients. But Sarah paused when she reached for her magnifying glass. Clara's right hand rested gently on Thomas's shoulder, but her left hand, folded in her lap, revealed something unsettling. Faint, yet unmistakable bands encircled each wrist, raised, scarred tissue, even visible through sepia tones. Sarah had seen scars like these before. They were the marks left by shackles worn for months, even years. Her pulse quickened. She spent the rest of the morning digitizing the photograph in high resolution, enlarging each detail without damaging the original. Under magnification, the scars became impossible to misinterpret, 2 inches wide, discolored, permanent. Clara's pose suddenly seemed intentional, her fingers arranged to hide what she could, though the camera had captured what history had not spoken aloud. Sarah called Patricia Coleman. Patricia, breathless with emotion, confessed that her family never knew. Clara rarely spoke of her past. The photograph had been treasured for generations, yet no one recognized the story written on her skin. Research consumed Sarah. She combed Civil War archives, slave ledgers, manumission papers, work equal parts, painstaking and devastating. A breakthrough came when Dorothy Harrison, an independent genealogist, replied to Sarah's inquiry. She had plantation ledgers from Ashford Plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina, listing a Clara among field workers in the 1850s and 60s. One entry chilled Sarah. Clara, disciplined for attempted escape, shackled 2 weeks. The scars in the photograph were no longer just remnants of bondage. They were proof of resistance. Sarah and Dorothy worked together. Slowly, Clara's history began to emerge from fragmented records. Clara had likely fled during the collapse of the slave economy in 1865, when Union forces advanced through the region. She appeared shortly after, on a Freedmen's Bureau ration list in Charleston, no surname given, then again in Richmond's marriage records in 1874. She married a man named Samuel Thompson and gave birth to Thomas the following year, but Samuel vanished from all known records soon after. Church documents later identified Clara as a widow, a seamstress, raising her son alone. Patricia invited Sarah to her home. She laid out family papers, including Thomas's diary written decades later. In it, he reflected on his mother, the work she took on to support him, the strength she carried, silently. One entry unsettled Sarah deeply. Thomas wrote of finding a cloth bundle after Clara's death, inside it a broken pair of iron shackles. As a boy, he'd noticed scars on her wrists. As a man, he finally understood. Piece by piece, Clara's story surfaced. From a plantation ledger, a bureau ration log, a marriage certificate, a church roster, a son's journal. A life once reduced to ink and property value was restored to human depth. The portrait now revealed two narratives, one of a free woman proud enough to be photographed with her son, and another of a survivor whose silence carried the weight of unspeakable memory, and through her scars, history finally spoke. The photograph from 1885 took on new dimensions of meaning. Clara, at approximately 42 years old, had survived slavery, escape, widowhood, and a decade of raising a child alone. She had worked as a seamstress, saved money, and chosen to have a formal portrait taken with her young son. This was more than a simple studio photograph. It was a declaration of survival, dignity reclaimed, and a mother's determination to document her love. Sarah contacted Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a medical historian who specialized in studying the physical evidence of slavery's brutality. Martinez had examined dozens of similar photographs, documenting the permanent marks bondage left on survivors' bodies. She agreed to analyze high-resolution images of Clara's wrists, and her report arrived 3 days later, detailed and sobering. The scarring visible in the photograph was consistent with iron shackles worn for extended periods, perhaps weeks or months. It suggested not only forced restraint during labor, but punitive confinement meant to prevent escape or punish resistance. The scars indicated restraints that had been too tight, repeatedly cutting into the skin. Over time, this would have caused deep tissue damage, resulting in the permanent scarring still visible 20 years after emancipation. Martinez noted something else. Clara's hands were positioned in a way that partially concealed the scars. Her right hand rested on her son's shoulder, confident and protective, while her left wrist was turned slightly away from the camera. It appeared Clara may have been uncertain whether she wanted these marks to be seen, yet the lighting captured them regardless. Whether by intention or accident, no one could know. The result was that her photograph preserved evidence she might have wished to hide. Sarah wondered whether Jonathan Blake, the photographer, had noticed. Had Clara spoken of her scars, or were they simply there, an unerasable part of her? She returned to Blake's ledgers at the Virginia Historical Society. Blake was known for treating black clients respectfully, but he still worked in a segregated society. What had he seen that day? There were no additional notes about the sitting, but something unusual appeared. Blake had made 2 prints of Clara's portrait, instead of 1. Normally, only a single print was produced, unless more were paid for. This suggested Blake had kept a copy, possibly for a sample book. Some photographers of the era recognized the historical value of documenting the lives of formerly enslaved people. Sarah contacted the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, which housed Blake's surviving books. A curator named James Patterson agreed to search the archives. 2 weeks later, he called with news. They had found it. A copy of Clara's portrait was preserved in a leather-bound album titled Portraits of Dignity, 1880-1890, containing about 40 portraits of black clients, all posed formally. Opposite Clara's photograph was Blake's handwritten note. Clara came to my studio with her young son in May 1885. She spoke little, but her bearing commanded respect. I noticed marks upon her wrists, unmistakable signs of bondage. When I inquired gently, she said she wished the photograph to show her and her son as they were, a free woman and her free child. She did not want to hide her past, but neither to be defined solely by it. And so I photographed them in their finest clothes, dignified and free. Yet the camera captured what words could not, that freedom does not erase scars. It only allows us to live beyond them. Sarah's research into Thomas's later life revealed how deeply Clara invested in his future. Despite her limited income, she enrolled him in the Richmond-colored normal school, one of the first institutions for black children in Virginia after the war. Records show Thomas attended from 1883 to 1889, ages 8 to 14. A surviving certificate of completion, signed by the principal, proved he had finished a full course of study in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and moral philosophy. Thomas later wrote in his diary that his mother believed education was everything. She took extra sewing work, stitching late into the night to pay his tuition. Many boys his age worked in warehouses or apprenticeships, but Clara insisted literacy was an inheritance no one could take. School records revealed an even more remarkable detail. In 1887, Clara herself enrolled in the school's evening literacy program. The ledger entry was simple. Clara Thompson, age 44, wishes to learn to write her name and read the Bible. Patricia, her descendant, had never known this. It moved her to tears. After slavery, after being forbidden to read, Clara went to school alongside her son. She believed it was not too late. Clara attended 2 terms before her name disappeared from the roster. Maybe work overtook her, maybe lessons proved difficult, or maybe she learned exactly what she needed. Thomas remembered the night she read aloud from the Bible for the first time, the Magnificat, her voice trembling, tears in her eyes. When she finished, she closed the book, silent for a long moment before saying, "Now I know what these words mean. Now I can read them. Myself." Thomas wrote, "That was the only time I ever saw my mother cry." As Sarah continued her research, the photograph drew widespread academic attention. Dr. Webb published an article analyzing how freed people used photography to assert dignity and memorialize freedom. High-resolution details of Clara's scars accompanied historical analysis, and other families came forward with their own photographs and questions. Scholars recognized Clara's portrait as part of a greater visual archive, images bridging slavery and freedom, trauma and survival. An exhibition soon followed, Portraits of Freedom, Photography and Black Life in Reconstruction America. Clara's portrait was featured prominently, displayed with Blake's handwritten note and Thomas's diary. Surrounding materials included maps of rice plantations, Freedmen's Bureau documents, statistics on black education, and other portraits of survivors whose bodies, like Clara's, held history. Patricia Coleman attended the opening in Richmond. She stood before her great-great-grandmother's image, enlarged, illuminated, unignorable, Clara's scarred wrists visible to all. Visitors moved slowly through the gallery, reading placards, studying the photographs, and confronting the legacy of slavery, and the determination of those who survived it. Patricia stood beside Sarah, gazing up at the portrait that had been in her family for generations. "I never knew," she whispered. "All these years, this photograph hung in our homes, passed down through our family, and we never really saw it. We saw ancestors dressed in their best clothes. We didn't see the scars. We didn't ask what Clara had endured." Sarah nodded gently. "Sometimes we only see what we're ready to see. Your family protected this image, kept her memory alive, even without knowing every part of the story. Now we're able to see the whole truth, not only her dignity, but her survival, her strength, her sacrifice. The exhibition also included a timeline of Thomas's life, reconstructed from census records, directories, and newspaper archives. After completing his education, he worked for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway for 40 years, rising from track maintenance to a supervisory role. He married a woman named Ruth in 1898, raised 4 children, and served as a deacon and Sunday school teacher. He lived long enough to see his grandchildren enter integrated schools after Brown versus Board. Although he died before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, his life, peaceful, stable, respected, existed because Clara had sacrificed for his education and future. Her legacy was not only the photograph, it was the life she made possible. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Sarah received an unexpected email from a woman named Catherine Ashford in Charleston, a name that made her pause, echoing the surname of the family that once enslaved Clara. Catherine wrote that she had discovered documents in her family estate that might be relevant to the research and wished to share them. She acknowledged that her family's history was painful, but believed honesty was necessary. When Sarah called her, Catherine explained she had found a trunk in her grandmother's attic, plantation ledgers, correspondence, and personal papers belonging to Richard Ashford. Most of the documents were disturbing to read, filled with casual accounts of buying, selling, and punishing human beings. But among them were letters of significance. One letter from 1863 complained about enslaved workers attempting escape, including Clara herself. She had fled the plantation, but was captured 3 miles away and shackled publicly as punishment. "These people do not understand the beneficence we show them," Richard Ashford wrote, revealing both cruelty and delusion. The documents confirmed what scars already told. Clara was punished for reaching toward her own freedom. Another letter, dated April 1865, written hurriedly by Ashford's wife, read, "The Yankees have come. The slaves have fled. The property is destroyed. We have lost everything." Catherine spoke quietly as Sarah read it. Her family had long portrayed themselves as victims of war and upheaval, never acknowledging the people whose stolen labor had built their wealth. "It has taken me years to understand what my ancestors really were," Catherine said. "The truth must be known." Sarah asked what she planned to do with the documents. Catherine replied that she would donate everything, ledgers, letters, all of it, to the South Carolina Historical Society, where descendants and researchers could access them. "People like Clara's family deserve to know," she said, "and people like mine must face what was done." Sarah thought of Clara standing in Jonathan Blake's studio in 1885, dressed in her finest clothing, her son beside her, her scars unhidden. Clara had not run from her past. She lived with it, carried it, and chose to be seen. She documented herself not as property, not as a tragedy, but as a survivor, a free woman, a mother. The exhibition remained open for 6 months and drew thousands. Teachers brought students to learn about the history written into bodies and photographs. Descendants of enslaved people arrived to honor resilience. Clara's portrait became one of the most discussed historical images of the year, appearing in documentaries, textbooks, and museum archives nationwide. Patricia later decided to donate the original photograph to the Historical Preservation Society so it would be protected and accessible for generations. She kept a high-quality reproduction in her home, but believed the original was larger than private memory. When she signed the donation papers, she visited the conservation vault, where the portrait would be stored. "She wanted us to see her," Patricia said softly. "That's why she made this portrait. Why she didn't hide her scars, why she stood tall with her son beside her. She wanted to be remembered not as a slave, but as a woman who survived slavery and built a life anyway." Sarah nodded. "And now she will be. Her story is documented, her strength preserved. We're finally learning how to read the evidence she left behind. The original portrait rested safely in its vault, but copies traveled across the world, in exhibitions, publications, digital archives, classrooms, and homes. Clara's face looked out across nearly 140 years, her scarred wrists visible proof of what she endured, her posture a testament to what she overcame. What first appeared to be just another 19th century studio photograph revealed itself as something far greater. A document of survival, a declaration of freedom, and a mother's love captured in silver and light. Thomas left one final diary entry in 1946, 6 years before his death. I am an old man now, and Mother has been gone 40 years, but I carry her with me still. The sacrifices she made, the strength she showed, these are my inheritance. When I look at our photograph, taken when I was a boy, I see not simply a portrait, but a promise kept. Mother promised I would live free, and I have. That is the measure of her love.